am Gioacchino Campese. I am from Italy, from Rome. I am a professor of pastoral theology of human mobility at the Pontifical Università Urbaniana, which is a Pontifical University in Rome. And I take the kind invitation that I received to participate to the missiology lectures in 2020, for which I thank the organizers and the Fuller Theological Seminary as an institution, as a precious opportunity, even if only virtually, to the ongoing pandemic, to promote and practice what I consider two key concepts for the Christian pilgrimage toward Catholicity: the culture of encounter and synodality. This opportunity has been facilitated by at least three facts. One, the organizers have given a very specific contextual focus to the missiology lectures 2020. Los Angeles as a global crossroads. I will speak from another specific context, the city of Rome, which represents itself a global crossroads in the larger framework of the European Mediterranean area, which specifically as a Mediterranean region is finally and progressively becoming an area of great interest for pastoral ministry and theological reflections. In this way, the Missiology Lectures 2020 becomes an opportunity for the encounter and conversation between two very interesting and challenging global crossroads, Los Angeles and Rome, as representatives of much larger geographical, cultural, and religious contexts. As a Roman Catholic, I consider this event as an inspiring moment of a larger Christian synodality, which goes beyond the borders and limitation of my own church. Even if I am new to the Fuller Theological Seminary, I am not new to its context. In fact, from 1995 to 2002, I lived between Tijuana, just across the border from Mexico, where I worked with migrants in a shelter founded by my religious order in 1987, and Los Angeles. So I lived from 1995 to 2002 between Tijuana and Los Angeles. This means that I have a pretty good picture of Los Angeles as a global crossroads, and at least in my view, as a part of a larger border area that begins in Tijuana and ends in Los Angeles itself. The outline that I will follow in this talk will be the following. In the first part, I will briefly reflect about the concepts, realities that appear in the title of this presentation, namely migration, religion, and world Christianity, from the perspective of my own context. And in a second part, I will develop the idea of Catholicity in terms of the two key concepts that I have mentioned earlier, the culture of encounter and synodality. I hope that in the course of this presentation, you will see that the main threads linking these concepts and realities are the migrants and the commitment of the Christian churches to be on the move in order to accompany humankind in its journey under the guidance of the Spirit. At that, when I speak about concepts such as synodality and Catholicity, I do so from a Roman Catholic perspective, but with world Christianity in mind. For those who have followed the developments in the Roman Catholic Church in the last 7 years, the terms culture of encounter and synodality will sound very familiar. But for those who have not, it is necessary to underline that for these concepts, and in general for this whole presentation, I am indebted to the teaching and ministry of the Bishop of Rome, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who, since his election in 2013, is more widely known as Pope Francis. I have not chosen Pope Francis as the main guide for this talk, simply because he is the head of the church to which I belong, but for much more substantial reasons, among which I mention four. The first, from the start, Pope Francis has been very clear about the main objective of his teaching and ministry, the missionary conversion of the church, a church that cannot just continue with the refrain We've done it always this way, but it is called to be bold and creative in rethinking itself in a change of epoch. Mission is the vital center of an ecclesia semper reformanda, a church that is always reforming itself. And the apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, stands as the programmatic document of this process of missionary conversion. Secondly, in many ways, Pope Francis represents and fosters world Christianity, and not simply because he is the first Latin American Pope. He has been purposefully including the voices of Catholicism from the global South in the life, teaching, and also governance of the Roman Catholic Church, which now looks little less Roman and considerably more Catholic. Perhaps the more symbolic gesture in this sense has been his decision to inaugurate the Jubilee Year of Mercy in 2015, not in Rome, the traditional center of Roman Catholicism, but in Bangui, the capital of the war-torn Central African Republic, a virtually unknown African city, which is, in his own words, became the spiritual capital of the world. Thirdly, when Francis visited the USA in 2015, he began his speech in the lawn of the White House with these words, unquote, "As the son of an immigrant family, I am happy to be a guest of this country, which was largely built by such families," end of quote. Always eager to give witness to his immigrant roots, Bergoglio has, since the beginning of his ministry as the Bishop of Rome, taken to heart the plight of migrants, refugees, victims of human trafficking, and internally displaced people, and put human mobility as one of the core issues at the center of the missionary conversion of the Church. Fourth, despite many obstacles, especially within the Church itself and his own limitation as a person, Francis is decently living up to his traditional title, that is the Pontiff, from the Latin pontifex, the maker of bridges, by striving accordingly to build bridges within the Roman Catholic Church itself, between the Roman Catholic Church and other Christian churches, supporting an ecumenism of common action and service, between Christianity and the world around some fundamental global issues, such as the care of creation, our common home, economic inclusion and sustainability, reconciliation and solidarity among peoples and nations, the plight of those who live at the margins, the peripheries of the world, and more specifically, the descartados, the wasted people of our planet, about whom we will talk later. In his in-flight press conference, going back to Rome from his trip in Mexico in 2016, he said, "A person who thinks only of building walls, wherever it may be, and not of building bridges is not Christian. This is not the gospel." Now let's go to the three first concepts and realities that are in the title of my presentation. The first one, migration. I will not refer here to data which are readily available for those who want to know the reality of migration, but that are unfortunately conveniently overlooked and manipulated by politicians and pundits who have interest in pushing a misrepresentation of migration. What I would like to do here is to highlight three aspects of the complex phenomenon of migration that I consider relevant for this presentation. The first one, the extraordinary emotional charge with which the whole issue is invested, a charge presented both in pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant fields, and that emerges both in political campaigns and debates, and in informal conversation everywhere. People, both individual and organizations, who accompany migrants and refugees in their journey are very passionate about this issue, a passion that becomes active compassion and solidarity. Instances of this compassion and solidarity that are often transformed into familiarity and proximity are numerous. and often amazing, both within society and the Christian churches. The latter, the Christian churches, are dedicating considerable resources to ministry with the migrants and refugees, from emergency action as search and rescue, shelter, etc., to the processes of integration within society and the ecclesial communities, constant advocacy, and the study of human mobility in its complexity. Among these examples of solidarity in civic society in Italy and Europe stand out the networks of families who have welcomed refugees in their homes. On the other hand, we are also witnessing manifestation of fear, hate, and also racial animosity, due also to a non-stop and well-organized effort to misrepresent migrants and refugees, promoted by political movements, mass media, and social media, which often become the public squares in which extremely offensive expression of contempt and hatred against migrants and people who accompany them circulate freely and with impunity. Interestingly enough, the official breakout of the COVID-19 in March 2020 has also caused the temporary disappearance of the issue of migration from public discourse. But after the first shock and with the relative improvement of the situation during the summer of 2020, the anti-immigrant movement and politicians have gone back to the usual scapegoating narrative of migrants who have been even accused of spreading the virus, of being the untori. Secondly, the division within civic and ecclesial community on the issue of migration is evident. Unfortunately, often the churches, especially at the local level, have left the discourse and representation of this issue in the hands of populist and xenophobic politicians and pundits, whose speeches and slogans, amplified by Twitter and other social media, dictate the mood of public and Christian opinion. The main problem is that because of this climate of fear and hostility, it becomes increasingly difficult to have a civil conversation about the issue of migration, and often to bridge this division among people pro and anti-immigrants becomes like a mission impossible, even within our Christian churches. Third, a very troubling element of this situation is, in my view, the manipulation of Christian discourse and symbols, even the gospel itself, to push a populist and xenophobic cultural and political agenda, using the argument that the Christian identity of Italy and Europe must be protected from the invasion of the Muslim immigrants. In this way, the far-right political movements, which in my assessment promote anti-evangelical ideas and practices, are emphatically advancing their claim to Christianity. The issue of religion. There is no doubt that migration has been changing the Italian and European religious landscape. And in this process, at least in Italy, can be summarized in this way. The country has gone from being a predominantly Roman Catholic country to a society with a quite significant religious plurality. This does not mean that Catholicism and its temples, its churches are disappearing. In a city such as Rome and any other important city in Italy, church buildings are normally the most visible and also beautiful structures, also because of the many works of arts that they contain. We begin by stating the obvious transformation. Migration makes Islam conspicuous. In Rome, for example, is home to one of the largest and most important mosques in Western Europe, which was built in 1995. Plus, perhaps more than 100 minor mosques and Islamic cultural center. And this is one of the great challenges that society has to face, a challenge that often, instead of being dealt with constructively, is represented automatically and conveniently in terms of an invasion and a necessarily unavoidable conflict with our supposed Christian or Catholic culture and identity. This is why many people, also in our churches, question the possibility of a real integration of Islam in our society. Then there is also the less obvious change, which does not receive nearly the same amount of attention by politicians, media, and also the Roman Catholic Church. What passes under the radar is the fact that thanks to migration, not only religion, but Christianity has become more plural in Italy. In this case, perceptions wins over statistics, because while perception supported by a misleading system of communication tells that Muslims represent the majority of migrants in this country, the data say that the majority of migrants in Italy are Christians, but mostly Orthodox, then also Roman Catholics, and finally Christian that can be ascribed to the extremely varied evangelical and Pentecostal galaxies. In other words, the religious transformation of Italian society poses not only and primarily interreligious challenges, represented mostly by Islam, but also by Buddhism and Sikhism, but especially ecumenical challenges. In this context, it will be certainly intriguing in the next decade to see how Catholicism will be affected by Christian pluralism, and how and if Christian faith and Roman Catholic popular tradition will be passed on to the second generations. I read all this transformation as a part of a larger process of progressive de-Westernization of Christianity in the world. The second, or rather, the third concept that we find at the beginning of the title of this presentation, world Christianity. It is at the same time a reality and a discipline that, in my opinion, are receiving a mixed reception. Although much has been written recently about world Christianity, in my experience, the best-known scholar in this field is the US historian Philip Jenkins, who in 2002 made popular the advent of a world Christianity with a more global southern face, and whose works have been translated in different languages. Here I remember the most important work by Philip Jenkins, which is The Next Christendom. Scholars have referred to Henry Van Dusen books in the 1940s as the beginning of the discipline of world Christianity, and also the awareness of the existence of a world Christianity, and have pointed to people such as Andrew Walls, Lamin Sanneh, Kwame Bediako as some of its main scholars, to whom also we could add Dana Robert, Dale Irvin, Scott Sandquist, Peter Phan, and others. I personally would like to highlight the 70s as the decade in which the awareness of the advent of a global Christianity is witnessed from different contexts, and particularly to the year 1974, when 3 scholars from 3 different continents contributed in distinct ways to this awareness. I am referring to the Swiss missiologist Walbert Buhlmann, Uruguayan historian Alberto Metol Ferré, and Kenyan theologian John Beattie. Buhlmann spoke about the coming of the church from the third world as the future of the global church. Metol Ferré said that the opportunity of a world church passed necessarily from the Latin American continent. And Beattie indicated Manila, Kinshasa, Addis Ababa, and Buenos Aires as the probable future centers of Christianity. I believe that Beattie never thought that Buenos Aires would truly become one of the centers of Christianity, since its Roman Catholic bishop became in 2013 the Bishop of Rome, Pope Francis. World Christianity is a well-known concept in English-speaking circles, and also in several faculties and centers in Europe dedicated to this discipline. In Italy, among theologians, probably not the majority, there is a growing awareness that Christianity is changing and becoming progressively less European and more global. These are mostly the scholars who study and know the dynamics of churches' mission and ecumenism. Yet, the scholars of world Christianity that have been mentioned earlier, among them, only Jenkins' works have been translated in Italian. Among the books on the mission that advanced the idea of a world Christianity, we have the Italian translation of the two classics of mission studies, like the ones by David Bosch, Transforming Mission, and Stephen Bevans and Roger Schroeder, Constance in Context. In the courses and relative bibliographies in the two faculties of missiology in Rome, at the Urbaniana and Gregorian universities, the expression of world Christianity appears rarely, if never. Gianni Colzani, who is arguably the most attentive Italian missiologist, in his recent book, Theology della Missione, in 2019, speak about this term, world Christianity, in a couple of pages, referring to the works of Walls and Bediaco. Andrea Toniolo, a pastoral theologian, Italian, who has very recently written a book on the different enculturation of Christianity in the world, especially from an Asian perspective, talks about the reality of world Christianity. But from the bibliography and the text of his work, one could conclude that he is not aware of world Christianity as a discipline. Certainly, the essential observation made by Toniolo is on point. The global character of Christianity is not simply historical, and I would add not even quantitative, just a question of numbers, but must become theological, as the main representatives of world Christianity are rightly affirming. Yet my impression is that in Italy we still think that our theology and our type of Christianity is the normative one. And so we give little attention to what is happening elsewhere in the Christian world. In the previous reflection on migration, we have highlighted the relevance of Christian migration in Italy and Europe, a global trend that has been already underlined by different missiologists. This is certainly the main way in which world Christianity becomes visible, and a reality that calls for action and reflection in Italy and in Europe. But there is also an aspect of this phenomenon that needs to be underscored. It does not consist only of the considerable presence of Christian immigrants in Italy and in Europe, but also includes an increasing number of pastors and ecclesial leaders from the global south. Just a few weeks ago, a Colombian priest, Roman Catholic, who has studied in Italy, has been ministering in the Diocese of Albano for some years now, reminded me that in this diocese, in this local church, which is found in the outskirts of Rome, 70% of the priests are foreign-born, 70%. This is a trend found also in a number of other Italian dioceses and in local churches in other important Western European countries, such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others. This fact poses many questions, such as, how are these pastors influencing Italian Catholicism and Christianity? And how they are received in Italian Roman Catholic context? And how come also in the academy, Western pastors going abroad are called missionaries? And in the global Southern pastors going to Western countries are just foreign priests? To conclude, migrants, and more specifically, Christian migrants, are, from the perspective of the Italian context, the people who are showing concretely the global face of Christianity today. In other words, they are not just and no longer the poor people Italian churches are called to help in faraway mission lands, but they are real people with whom we live, work, and worship. What happens is that it's much easier to deal with Asians, African, and Latin Americans from afar than in our own context. This observation introduces us to the second part of this presentation on the issue of Catholicity and its challenges. Just to be clear, Catholicity is not here to be understood as the first name of a Christian churches, but as one of the essential qualities of Christianity. Christianity is Catholic because it must be lived and understood from the whole, including every ecclesial communities that professes its faith in Jesus, and not just from some of its parts and expressions. Christianity is expressed, celebrated, and thought out in many different ways, and all of them must be considered to have the whole Christian picture. Because if we would not do that, if we are not Catholic in our perspective and imagination, we would be disregarding the gifts of the Spirit and the beauty of the varied face of the Church. Francis affirms, in the diversity of peoples who experience the gift of God, each in accordance with his own culture, the Church expresses her genuine Catholicity and shows forth the beauty of her varied face. This is Evangelii Gaudium, paragraph 116. This is why we are called to take on more seriously and systematically the theme of Catholicity. I recently found a stimulating reflection on this subject by Stephen Bevans, who, following the insight of Darrell Gooder, rightly interprets Catholicity as a missional mark, a missional quality of the Church, to be considered ad intra and ad extra. However, it is not the intention of this presentation to offer a systematic reflection on Catholicity, for which much more time and space would be needed, but simply to suggest two fundamental ways toward Catholicity following Pope Francis' teaching. The first way is exemplified by an ever-present expression in Francis' teaching, the culture of encounter, which in Francis' mind is the opposite, actually the answer to what he has denounced as globalization of indifference, the throwaway culture, and also indirectly the clash of civilization or cultures that has become so fashionable in our times, since Samuel Huntington came out with this catchphrase in the 90s. It is fundamental to understand that the culture of encounter does not just stand for a cultural change in an environment in which polarization seems to have gotten the upper hand. And it becomes increasingly difficult to dialogue among people who disagree because of the supposed incompatibility among different ways of living and thinking. It is also more than a firm and countercultural ethical stance. In Francis' thought, it has, first of all, a theological, Christological, and missionary dimension. The culture of encounter has, first of all, a theological, Christological, and missionary dimension. The depth of this expression is testified by the fact that at times it has been communicated by Francis as the mysticism of encounter, not just as the culture of encounter, but the mysticism of encounter, which underscores the divine mystery hidden and revealed in human encounters. Unquote, so be men and women of communion. Have the courage to be present in the midst of conflict and tension as a credible sign of the presence of the Spirit, who inspires in human hearts a passion for all to be one. Live the mysticism of encounter, which entails the ability to hear, to listen to other people, the ability to seek together ways and means. Live in the light of the loving relationship of the three divine persons, the model of all interpersonal relationships. This from a speech, end quote, this is from a speech from Pope Francis. In this sentence, the Pope exposes some of the main characteristics of the culture of encounter. The exhortation to have the courage and the passion to be people who unite in times of conflict and division. That doing this is a witness to the presence of the Spirit in the midst of humankind. The ability and willingness to listen and seek together ways to go forward shows and anticipates the vital connection between the culture of encounter and synodality, the second way toward Catholicity that we want to suggest here. But most importantly, the origin of the culture of encounter, which is the loving relationship among the three persons of the Trinity. This theological Trinitarian element is further developed by Francis in another affirmation, such as, unquote, whenever we encounter another person in love, we learn something new about God. Whenever our eyes are opened to acknowledge the other, we grow in the light of faith and knowledge of God. End of quote. In the encounter with the person, we learn something more about God, because in this encounter, Jesus himself was become flesh, one with humankind, in order to encounter and redeem humankind. But here, Francis becomes even more specific. Unquote. Sometimes we are tempted to be that kind of Christian who keeps the Lord's wounds at arm's length. Yet Jesus wants us to touch human misery, to touch the suffering flesh of others. End of quote. It is by encountering the wounds of the humankind that we encounter the real Jesus. And among that wounded humanity, the discarded, we find often migrants, refugees, and victims of human trafficking. And here is the Christological connection. We cannot encounter Jesus without encountering people, especially those who are suffering. The consequence is a call to continue Jesus' mission, which is the mission of encountering people, especially the wounded and the discarded, the suffering flesh of Christ. Again, unquote, the gospel tells us constantly to run the risk of a face-to-face encounter with others, with their physical presence, which challenges us with their pain and their pleas, with their joy, which infects us in our close and continuous interaction. True faith in the incarnate Son of God is inseparable from self-giving, from membership in the community, from service, from reconciliation with others. The Son of God, by becoming flesh, summoned us to the revolution of tenderness. The mission to which we have been summoned by Jesus, who became flesh, is the revolution of tenderness, which requires the culture of encounter, and it is nothing easy or to be too romanticized, because it requires a constant interaction, as we saw in the quote in English by Pope Francis. Well, the Spanish translation of that interaction is cuerpo a cuerpo, which is almost hand-to-hand combat, hand-to-hand struggle, which means a struggle with ourselves and the others in order to create solidarity, fraternity, and sorority within a polarized humankind. In the synodal document dedicated to youth, he expands on this idea and connects it with other elements already mentioned in this presentation. Unquote, it is not easy. It always means having to give something up and to negotiate. But if we do it for the sake of helping others, we can have the magnificent experience of setting our differences aside and working together for something greater. If, as a result of our own simple and at times costly efforts, we can find points of agreement amid conflict, build bridges, and make peace for the benefit of all, then we will experience the miracle of the culture of encounter. Again, the miracle of the culture of encounter. This is something which young people can dare to pursue with passion. End of quote. I believe it is clear by now that the culture of encounter is not simply a moral or optional exhortation, but it represents an essential evangelical call, something that each and all of Jesus' disciples must do if they want to follow Jesus. And there cannot be Catholicity, this inclusive journey toward the whole, without this culture. What has been said about the culture of encounter shows the intimate link that exists between it and synodality, which is not simply a secondary trait of the Church, but an essential one. In his most important speech on this theme, Francis treats synodality as constitutive elements of the Church. He says, unquote, if we understand as St. John Chrysostom that Church and Synod are synonymous, inasmuch as the Church is nothing other than the journey together of God's flock along the paths of the history towards the encounter with the Christ the Lord, then we understand too that within the Church, no one can be raised up higher than others. On the contrary, in the Church, it is necessary that each person lower himself or herself so as to serve our brothers and sisters along the way. Synodality is, in other words, the way the Church walks together in history, in faith and service, under the merciful guidance of the Father, the steadfast and loving accompaniment of the Son, and the life-giving and energizing breath of the Spirit. Much has been written recently in Roman Catholic circles about synodality, especially since Francis has made it the pillar of the missionary conversion reform of the Church. But also in this case, I just raise a few brief points about this theme, which I deem relevant to our discussion. Firstly, the synodal style requires humility and courage. And Pope Francis is very clear about this. Before any synodal event, he reminds the participants that they have to listen in humility and they have to have courage in speaking. Humility in listening and courage in speaking are inseparable in a synodal process. 2, inclusion is fundamental, and I believe that at least in the Roman Catholic Church, this aspect has become very explicit during the recent Pan-Amazon Synod, which has taken place in Rome from October 6 to 27, 2019. The participation of many members of indigenous people with their tradition and custom, fruits of a long process of the inculturation of the Christian faith, has really challenged a certain Western understanding of Catholicity within our ecclesial communities. Equally important, this is the point that I want to make, is that finally, at the table around which the usual Christian leaders and people are comfortably seated, there were also the people Francis defines as the descartados, the discarded, the product of the throwaway culture. And it is important to understand that the descartados are not just the exploited and the excluded, but they are the people often treated by our society as waste, as garbage, as basura, desechos, as he says in Spanish. They are literally thrown away. And it is these people that Francis insists to have around the table of synodal processes. Third, it is simply to be expected that synodal processes will cause confrontation, opposition, tension, and conflict. But Francis does not consider this a problem, but on the contrary, as an opportunity to continue the journey of conversion, change, and reform. Lastly, and most importantly, dulcis in fundo, as they say in Latin, there is the protagonism of the Holy Spirit. There is no doubt in Francis' mind that the main protagonist of any synodal process is the Spirit, and not its human participants. Without the Spirit, there is no synod. In his recent letter to the Roman Catholic Church in Germany that is going through a synodal journey, he says, unquote, "In substance, we are talking about a synod under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, which means to walk together under its light, direction, and inruption, to learn to listen and discern the always new horizon that the Spirit wants to gift us with, because synodality supposes and requires the eruption of the Holy Spirit." And Francis is very straightforward about the unpredictability and the unexpected turns that the Spirit suggests during the synod. And since some of the most effective observations by Francis come during his spontaneous remarks, I will mention one of these during a general assembly of his diocese, the Church of Rome. He was criticizing some local churches that had given in to the temptation of functionalism, what he calls functionalism, wherein churches are concerned about perfect organization, departments on different issues, academic studies and analysis of the reality, while at the same time the ecclesial community is slowly but surely distancing itself from the mission, the proclamation of the gospel, and from the reality of the discarded, the descartados. Synods in such churches, says Francis, are able only to rearrange things, not to produce a real missionary conversion. The Pope says in this regard, unquote, "To be a synod, there must be the Holy Spirit." And listen to this. And the Holy Spirit kicks the table, throws it away, and begins again. To be a synod, there must be the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit kicks the table, throws it away, and begins again. I would like to conclude my reflections inspired by this unusual remark by Francis. We have said that migrants and refugees are among the most convincing messengers of a Christianity that is no longer just Western, but global. Now, through the ideas of cultures of encounter and synodality, we want to add that the encounter with the flesh of migrants and refugees, which is the flesh of Christ, that said, "I was a stranger, you welcomed me," in Matthew 25:35, makes them, the migrants and the refugees, the ambassadors of the Spirit that keeps the table. And I would add also the rest of the furniture that makes us comfortable in our churches and round tables. In this way, migrants and refugees, inspired by the Spirit, push us to the return to the mission, to the way. At the beginning, in the Acts of the Apostles, the Christians were those of the way. To the journey together, where we can share the essential, which is the joy of the gospel. That is the essential of our mission. And in this journey, we discover that these brothers and sisters of ours, the migrants and the refugees, are the prophets of Catholicity, the irreplaceable witnesses of the beautiful variety of Christianity. Thank you very much.